the U.S. military attack on a Venezuelan boat and a history of American atrocities. The United States military strike on a Venezuelan vessel in the southern Caribbean on September 2, 2025, which resulted in the deaths of 11 individuals, has sparked intense debate and criticism. The Trump administration claimed the boat was operated by the Tren de Aragua gang, designated as a foreign terrorist organization, and was transporting illegal narcotics. However, the absence of substantial evidence to support these claims, coupled with the lack of transparency regarding the legal authority for the strike, has led many to question its legitimacy. This incident is not an isolated event, but part of a broader pattern of U.S. actions that have been criticized as unjustified, excessive, or in violation of international law. This essay examines the Venezuelan boat strike as a recent example of U.S. military overreach and explores other historical and contemporary atrocities committed by the United States, providing detailed explanations of their context, impact, and implications. On September 2, 2025, the U.S. Navy conducted an airstrike on a 4-engine speedboat in the southern Caribbean, which President Donald Trump claimed was carrying drugs and operated by members of the Tren de Aragua gang. The strike, which killed 11 people, was announced with a video posted on Trump's Truth Social platform, showing a speedboat being struck and exploding. The administration described the operation as a lethal and precision strike against narco-terrorists, with Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth asserting that such operations would continue to combat drug trafficking in the region. However, several critical issues cast doubt on the legitimacy of this action. First, the U.S. government has provided no concrete evidence to substantiate claims that the vessel was carrying narcotics or that its occupants were members of Tren de Aragua. Unlike typical drug interdiction operations, which are usually handled by the U.S. Coast Guard and involve boarding and inspecting vessels, this strike involved immediate lethal force. Legal experts have noted that the administration failed to demonstrate an imminent threat to U.S. national security, a requirement under international law for justifying such an attack. The designation of Tren de Aragua as a foreign terrorist organization does not automatically authorize lethal military action, especially without evidence of an armed threat or direct link to terrorism. Second, the strike raises significant concerns about violations of international maritime and human rights law. According to experts, the use of lethal force in international waters without clear evidence of an imminent attack or prior aggressive actions by the target constitutes an extrajudicial killing. The Venezuelan government has denied the U.S. claims, asserting that the footage is fabricated and that no independent verification of the strike's details exists. The lack of transparency, including the Pentagon's failure to release specifics about the operation or the nature of the alleged drugs, further undermines the justification for the attack. This incident reflects a broader trend of the U.S. employing military force in ways that bypass established legal frameworks, prioritizing political messaging over accountability. The Trump administration's escalation of military presence in the Caribbean, including the deployment of warships and a nuclear-powered submarine, suggests a strategic shift toward treating drug trafficking as a military rather than a law enforcement issue. This approach risks further destabilizing U.S.-Venezuela relations and setting a precedent for unchecked military actions against civilian targets. The Venezuelan boat strike is only one recent example of actions by the United States that have been criticized as atrocities, defined here as acts of extreme violence, human rights violations, or unjustified aggression that cause significant harm. Below, we explore other notable instances of U.S. atrocities, both recent and historical, to contextualize the 2025 incident within a broader pattern of behavior. The 2003 U.S.-led invasion of Iraq, justified on the grounds of eliminating weapons of mass destruction, WMDs, and combating terrorism, is a prominent example of an unjustified military action with catastrophic consequences. The Bush administration claimed that Iraq, under Saddam Hussein, possessed WMDs and posed an imminent threat to global security. However, no WMDs were found, and the intelligence used to justify the invasion was later revealed to be flawed or manipulated. The war resulted in the deaths of over 100,000 Iraqi civilians, displaced millions, and destabilized the region, contributing to the rise of extremist groups like ISIS. One of the most infamous episodes of the Iraq War was the Abu Ghraib prison scandal in 2004, where U.S. military personnel were found to have tortured and abused Iraqi detainees. Photographs revealed detainees subjected to physical and psychological torture, including beatings, sexual humiliation, and mock executions. These acts violated the Geneva Conventions and sparked global outrage. The scandal highlighted a broader culture of impunity within the U.S. military, as only low-ranking soldiers faced prosecution, while senior officials escaped accountability. The Iraq War and Abu Ghraib remain enduring symbols of U.S. overreach and disregard for human rights in the pursuit of geopolitical objectives. The U.S. drone program, initiated under the Bush administration and expanded under Obama, Trump, and Biden, has been responsible for numerous civilian deaths in countries such as Pakistan, Yemen, and Somalia. These strikes, often conducted under the guise of targeting terrorists, have frequently lacked transparency and accountability. A 2013 strike in Yemen, for example, killed 12 civilians attending a wedding, based on faulty intelligence that mistook the gathering for a terrorist meeting. The Bureau of Investigative Journalism estimates that U.S. drone strikes in Pakistan alone have killed between 900 and 2,200 civilians, including over 200 children since 2004. The lack of clear evidence to justify many of these strikes mirrors the Venezuelan boat incident. Drone operations often rely on vague or unreliable intelligence, and the U.S. has been criticized for failing to provide adequate post-strike investigations or compensation for civilian casualties. These actions have fueled anti-American sentiment and contributed to cycles of violence in affected regions, undermining U.S. claims of promoting global stability. During the Vietnam War, the My Lai Massacre stands as one of the most egregious examples of U.S. military atrocities. On March 16, 1968, U.S. Army soldiers from Charlie Company killed between 347 and 504 unarmed Vietnamese civilians, including women, children, and infants, in the village of My Lai. The soldiers, acting on orders to eliminate Viet Cong sympathizers, engaged in mass murder, rape, and mutilation. The massacre was initially covered up by the U.S. military, and only came to light through investigative journalism. The My Lai Massacre exposed systemic issues within the U.S. military, including a lack of oversight, dehumanization of Vietnamese civilians, and a culture of aggression fueled by the pressures of guerrilla warfare. Only one soldier, Lieutenant William Calley, was convicted, and his sentence was later reduced, reflecting a pattern of leniency for U.S. personnel involved in atrocities. The massacre remains a stark reminder of the human cost of U.S. military interventions and the failure to hold perpetrators fully accountable. In March 2017, a U.S. airstrike in Mosul, Iraq, targeting ISIS fighters, killed at least 105 civilians, including entire families, in a residential neighborhood. The strike was part of the U.S.-led coalition's campaign to liberate Mosul from ISIS control. Investigations later revealed that the U.S. military had underestimated the presence of civilians in the area and failed to verify the target adequately. The incident was one of the deadliest single airstrikes in the campaign, yet the U.S. military initially downplayed the civilian toll and conducted minimal follow-up investigations. The Mosul airstrike exemplifies the recurring issue of collateral damage in U.S. military operations, where the pursuit of strategic objectives often overshadows the protection of civilian lives. The lack of accountability and transparency in such incidents parallels the concerns raised about the 2025 Venezuelan boat strike, where the absence of evidence and the use of lethal force raise questions about proportionality and legality. While not a military operation, the Trump administration's zero-tolerance policy in 2018, which led to the forced separation of thousands of migrant children from their parents at the U.S. Mexico border, has been widely condemned as a human rights atrocity. Implemented by the Department of Homeland Security with support from federal agencies, the policy resulted in over 5,500 children being detained in overcrowded facilities, often without adequate care or communication with their families. The psychological and physical harm inflicted on these children, many of whom were fleeing violence and persecution, drew comparisons to historical abuses such as internment camps. The policy was justified as a deterrent to illegal immigration, but critics, including the United Nations, argued that it violated international human rights standards. The lack of a clear plan to reunite families and the chaotic implementation of the policy underscored a disregard for basic humanitarian principles. This episode highlights how U.S. policies, even those outside traditional military contexts, can perpetrate significant harm when driven by ideological agendas rather than evidence or compassion. The incidents described above, from the 2025 Venezuelan boat strike to historical atrocities like My Lai, share several common themes. First, they often involve the use of excessive or disproportionate force without sufficient evidence to justify the action. Whether it's the absence of WMDs in Iraq, the lack of proof of narcotics on the Venezuelan boat, or the faulty intelligence behind drone strikes, these cases reflect a willingness to act decisively without rigorous verification. Second, there is a recurring pattern of limited accountability. In cases like Abu Ghraib and My Lai, only low-ranking individuals faced consequences, while senior officials or policymakers often escaped scrutiny. Similarly, the Venezuelan boat strike has seen no independent investigation or detailed public disclosure, leaving questions about its legality unanswered. Third, these actions frequently violate international law or norms, whether through extrajudicial killings, civilian casualties, or disregard for sovereignty. The U.S. unilateral approach in many of these incidents, often bypassing international bodies like the United Nations, has strained diplomatic relations and fueled perceptions of American exceptionalism. Finally, these atrocities have long-term consequences, both for the affected populations and for U.S. global standing. Civilian deaths and human rights abuses contribute to anti-American sentiment, radicalization, and regional instability. The Venezuelan boat strike, for instance, risks escalating tensions with Venezuela and other Latin American countries, potentially undermining cooperative efforts to address drug trafficking and migration. The U.S. military strike on a Venezuelan boat in 2025, lacking substantial evidence of drug trafficking or an imminent threat, represents a troubling continuation of a historical pattern of American atrocities. From the My Lai Massacre to the Iraq War, drone strikes, and the Mosul airstrike, the United States has repeatedly engaged in actions that prioritize strategic or political goals over human rights and international law. These incidents reflect systemic issues, including a lack of transparency, inadequate accountability, and a willingness to use lethal force without sufficient justification. Addressing this pattern requires a commitment to rigorous oversight, adherence to international legal standards, and a re-evaluation of the U.S. its approach to global engagement. Only through such measures can the United States begin to repair the damage caused by its actions and restore its credibility on the world stage.